and Joan is on the steering committee of Zero COVID. And just a couple of, words in starting. Our campaign's been going on for a couple of years now, well, not 18 months. Joan can talk a bit more about it. And, I think we want to keep it going because we're living in a world of crisis, turmoil, facing barbarism with, as we know, war coming on, the climate chaos, increasing exploitation and poverty. And in all that, with the big news that we are seeing over the last few days in Eastern Europe, we mustn't forget the pandemic because it comes out of our society, out of the system that we live in, which is allowed through the environmental thrashing of the planet, pathogens to jump species, and as Professor Robert West was saying in the beginning, unfortunately, we may well be seeing quite possibly new variants coming in the near future. And one of the things to deal with that is actually a proper health service, a proper politics of public health, which looks after people first of all, and is not concerned with private profit. And the NHS is absolutely important in that, in terms of having a publicly provided health system from the cradle to the grave. So without further ado, I'll leave Jacky Davis to kick off for about 8-10 minutes. And thanks a lot, Steve, for coming in. And then we'll conclude with Joan, and I'll introduce Steve later on. So, Jacky, I'll let you know approximately after 9 minutes or so that you've had your time. Okay, great, cheers. Thanks. Go ahead.
Save me keeping an eye on my watch. Thanks very much, and thanks for asking me here today, and thanks for asking me to talk about what I know most about at the moment, which is what happened to the NHS during the pandemic and why how response has been so bad. And thanks for the mention of the book. John Lister and I are doing it at the moment, NHS Under Siege. We hope to have it out by April. It's really a very quick book to look at, try and learn lessons. Some of you may know about the People's COVID Inquiry. And a lot of what I'll say today comes from the People's COVID Inquiry. Our campaign, Keep Our NHS Public, ran an inquiry from January until June last year. Oh, sorry.
That's all right, go ahead.
No, I've just got something right up in the middle of my screen, which is telling me there's a recording in progress. Okay. And we took evidence from over 40 people during that. And there was a huge range of people from international, professors from New Zealand, international public health people, right through to frontline workers, bereaved families for justice. And we really learned some terrible, shocking things. And the interesting thing about it was a lot of us know those things, but when they all come together in one place, which is what we're trying to do with the book, it really is dreadful. So I'm just going to do a commercial break here. This is the report from the People's COVID Inquiry. Misconduct in public office, that was a suggestion of Michael Mansfield, who oversaw the inquiry, because the government did behave in what many of us consider to be a criminal way. And I'm just going to look in my allotted time today about why that was. So why was our response to the pandemic bad? Because we have undoubtedly have a more deaths, bigger economic hit than other countries. Well, to start with, the NHS was already in crisis. It was 100,000 staff short. It had fewer hospital beds than most of our economic contemporaries. And so it was already in a bad state. And that was a decade of so-called austerity. And thanks you to the Tories for that. And at the same time, social care, our public services had been run down over a decade to the extent that health markers had started to go backwards, that life expectancy had started to go backwards. Now that's truly, truly shocking. So the NHS was in crisis, social care was in crisis, and we heard during the People's COVID Inquiry from the Secretary of the Pensioners Convention, who said they had written numerous times to the government asking for a review of what went on and to improve social care. Never heard back from them. So public services were already reduced to a terrible state when the pandemic came along. And then we had the government we had, which was, the worst possible people in place at the worst possible time. So they had some pandemic planning. We know we've had to drag the information out of them, but they did exercise Cygnus, they did exercise Alice, both of which told them 4 years before the pandemic that we weren't prepared for a pandemic. And so what did they do? They shelved them. They didn't take any notice of the recommendations about PPE stockpiling, about what would happen on the front line, about how we would run test and traces, none of that, because they didn't want to spend the money. And they, in fact, denied it up until the fact they were taken to court and made to reveal that Exercise Alice had taken place. Then we had the worst possible prime minister at the worst possible time, who thought it was a joke, who talked about herd immunity, take it on the chin, boast of shaking hands with people, and then got it himself and nearly died. And we had late lockdowns. So while other people were busy preparing for the pandemic, we had the Cheltenham Racing Festival. I think 250,000 people attended that. We had international football matches. So it had run through the community before anybody started to do anything. And we had late lockdowns consistently. So I think the Resolution Foundation have estimated that there were 27,000 avoidable deaths just because of the late lockdown in the autumn of that year. So the Tories, I would have to say, have got a lot of blood on their hands. So there were no proper stockpiles. The maintenance of stockpiles had been outsourced to a whole hodgepodge of companies, so they hadn't been maintained. It was impossible to access them. Half the stuff was out of date. And we had a PPE disaster. As everybody knows, we had staff in bin bags. We had a lot of deaths among NHS staff. We had people going to local veterinary services. We had people knitting things. I mean, it was extraordinary. And the government expecting NHS workers to go to work every day, put their lives on the line and die. It's impossible to get out of the government how many NHS workers died in the line of duty, but it's certainly somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000. Then what did they do? We've got one of the best health services in the world, just about still, one of the best public health services in the world. The government kept ignoring it and turning to the private sector. So they outsourced test and trace, and we all know what happened there. 37 billion spent on a system which even the government's own committees said made no difference or little appreciable difference to what happened in the pandemic. They turned people away from their GPs towards NHS 111, which was a very steep learning curve for the people they employed. I haven't got time, we can go later to all the inappropriate questions they were asking people. And they turned to the private sector for procurement of things like PPE. And I have to say, my husband said to me, don't ever write another book because you get so angry when you write books. And it's true, we've done 3 books now. And every time I get really angry and reading about what happened with this procurement, you would not believe it. Contracts to jewelers in Miami for £240 million who'd never made a piece of PPE before, while people who knew about PPE were turned away. And yet, I'm sure everybody's heard all of this, but they had this VIP lane for people, who were friends of Tory ministers. So there were many, many contracts with red flags for corruption. There was a systemic bias towards political friends. Very importantly, not only did they fail to protect frontline workers in the country, and of course that includes, not only we found out who essential workers were. They were the NHS staff, but they were the public transport people. They were the teachers. They were the people who stacked shelves in supermarkets. They were all the people who had to go to work every day. And guess what? They were, by and large, people who weren't very well off, often from the minority ethnic community. And the government didn't protect them either. And not only that, they didn't protect the vulnerable in our society. So the poor, the minority ethnic, the elderly. Hancock had the cheek to say that he put a ring round half the deaths in the first wave were in care homes. Migrants, disabled, learning disabled, all those people died in disproportionate numbers. The government were very bad about messaging. There was mixed messaging the whole time because they were ambivalent about what they were doing. Johnson really the whole time wanted to put the economy before the health of the nation. And we all know that, in fact, if you do that, you do badly in both areas in the long run. But he said, Cummings has said that Johnson said, let the bodies pile high, because they were going to be old people and he didn't care. So we had that. What we heard in the People's COVID inquiry was they didn't listen to or talk to experts. So we heard from people in education. They never talked to the education unions. They never talked to the people who ran elderly services. They never talked to the people who ran the services for the disabled. And it was quite extraordinary that they did not do that. We haven't really got time to talk about what happened to children. Their education was disrupted. Those from poor families had a more difficult time because there was no space at home. They didn't have the learning facilities at home. Often their parents had to go to work. They messed up exams. They sent them back to school and then they dragged them out again. And this was because they never talked to the teaching unions about it. So I'm going to stop there because there's so much to say. Buy the book, NHS Under Siege. But what's really annoying now, and I think this is our job, is to hear Johnson and his coterie saying, we got the big things right. And they did not get the big things right. And I think that is a really important message for us to get out to the population, because votes will come sooner or later. Thousands of people died avoidable deaths. That's what's so shocking. The other countries did not have these numbers. And Johnson said, I've got a quote in the book somewhere, we've done our best, we did our best, we've always stuck by the science. I could use a word, but I won't. It's just rubbish. And now they're really not abiding by the science. Who has seen any scientists since they said they were going to drop all COVID precautions? Nobody, because that's just a decision on his part to take the heat off himself over the whole Partygate business. So they seem to have learned nothing. And I'm just going to end on a topical note, because that's just about the NHS. But what struck me today in all the news, the terrible news, it gives me goose pimples to say it, but the terrible news coming from the Ukraine is what is happening about COVID on top of all that. We've got hospitals full of injured soldiers now. I just read they haven't got enough oxygen in Ukraine hospitals. So it's not, sure, we have got to fight for our NHS, and we've got to fight for our country, in a sense, in the face of this government who are doing their best to trash everything that we hold dear. But we've also got to think what's going on out there in terms of this terrible situation in the world, because COVID hasn't even appeared in any conversation I've seen about what's going on in the Ukraine with people stuck in bunkers in, underground and all the rest of it. So it's very important we don't let this slide, as Fred said, but we don't let this slide away from us while World War III is breaking out and Putin's, a megalomaniac is threatening us with nuclear weapons. And it's just great that you're keeping this going. And just to hold this up again, you can buy this. I'll put a link in the sidebar. You can buy this from the KOMP website. It's a very, very interesting read. And our book is based in part on this. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jacky. Fascinating. And just a reminder to everybody here, Jacky's and John Lister's book out in a few weeks' time. From Merlin Press. And I don't think, Jacky or any of us should apologise for being angry about how the government's been dealing with the NHS, because if you're angry, you'll do something. So if you buy the book, you'll get the information, you'll be angry, and you'll do something. So that's a plug for the book again. Anyway, our next speaker is Steve Reicher, who's a social behaviour scientist. I think I got it right, Steve, at St Andrews University, and also and one of the members of Independent Sage. And I always find him fascinating, as all of us. And it's great to have you here, Chris. So it's over to you.
Hi. Yeah, I'm a social psychologist.
Beg your pardon.
At the University of St Andrews, and have been involved in the response to COVID on a UK government and Scottish government level, as well as being involved in Independent Sage. And certainly, it's interesting to contrast the Scottish with the UK experience. But I just want to start off with something I was reading this morning. I was reading The Observer, and its account of the England-Wales rugby match. And it had a phrase in it where it talked about the first post-pandemic rugby match at Twickenham. And it struck me that if even the Observer, which is supposed to be on our side, talks about post-pandemic, then we've really got a problem. I mean, the first thing that I want to stress, and if nothing else, I think we need to remember this, is that there is a tendency in this discussion to be remarkably parochial, to think about the UK. Occasionally we think about the globe, but most of the time we talk about the UK. Now, at a global level, still only 6.5% of people in low-income countries are vaccinated, with even one jab. 6.5%, 1 in 16 people, 15 in 16 not protected at all. And we don't know the death rates because they're not recorded and the testing isn't happening. but it's been estimated that probably we're up to 30 or 40 million people who have died, and many, many more will die. And of course, one of the reasons why only 1 in 16 people in low-income countries is vaccinated is because the UK in particular is one of the few governments left who are blocking the waiving of vaccine patents. It's one of the very few things on which the US, China, and Russia agree. I mean, given what's going on in the globe, you might think they agree on nothing, but all 3 of those governments have agreed there need to be vaccine patent waivers. So when you talk about blood on their hands, certainly there is domestic blood on this government's hands, but globally, we have contributed to this pandemic, killing many millions of people. It's a complete disgrace. And to talk about a post-pandemic world when that's going on is a sign of the most remarkable, parochial way of looking at the world. And if the deaths of millions aren't enough to move people's conscience, there is, of course, the added fact that the more the infection rages, the more the chance of new variants arising, which will come back to haunt us in this country. If you don't care about anybody else in the world, even narrow national self-interest tells you it is an idiocy not to allow the vaccines to go around the world. But of course, it's not only an idiocy internationally, it's also an idiocy nationally. The ONS survey last Friday comes out every week. The figures are lagged by about a week, but it's about the only data we've still got, which tells us reasonably accurately the state of the pandemic. It showed that the levels of infection in the UK remain remarkably high, almost as high as they've ever been, certainly as high as they ever were before Omicron. In Scotland, the numbers infected have increased from 1 in 25 to 1 in 20. In the small country of Scotland, I live in Scotland, a country of some 5 million people, 240,000 people were infected, according to the survey last week. So still, we are in the midst of a pandemic. And of course, the real problem with what the government did last week in lifting restrictions, it was a bit like, we all remember George Bush standing on that warship, on that aircraft carrier. And I think it was as early as April of 2003, declaring victory in Iraq. Well, Johnson's declaration of victory is as premature as Bush's declaration of victory was. This has got nothing to do with the state of the pandemic. It has, as we've just heard, everything to do with domestic politics, with trying to distract from his local difficulties. The pandemic clearly is not over. And so what are the problems? What are the problems of declaring it over? And I want to talk about 4 things today. The first, of course, is that it will lead to an increase in infection. That's bound to happen. It will lead to an increase in infection because people won't test themselves and know whether they're infected or not. It will increase because people who do know that they're infected will be going out into the public and spreading the infection. And unless you believe that infections don't matter at all, well, that's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, not because that many people are dying right now, but even just hospitalizing people. First of all, it's a huge burden on those individuals. It's a traumatic burden on those individuals. It's a traumatic burden on the NHS, which, as we know, is horrifically overstretched. So infections do matter, and that's before you start talking about long COVID. And week after week after week, new papers emerge about the fact that this is a complex multi-system disease which has physical consequences and mental consequences. Big paper last week coming out from the US showing the degree of mental problems caused by COVID, because of course it resides in the brain. The fact that people lose smell and taste tells you that this is a virus which goes into our brains and has a whole series of consequences. So the first and the simplest and sufficient to condemn the government is the argument that this will lead to increased infection in a multi-system disease whose consequences we still don't fully understand. The second problem, of course, is the problem of inequalities. When Johnson says, it's up to you, you now decide, I'm setting you free. He talks about lifting restrictions when actually what he's lifting is protections and support. What it means is that if you are ill and you are affluent, yes, you'll be able to stay at home. You'll be able to work from home. You'll be fine. But if you're on 0-hours contracts, if you're in precarious employment, if you can't afford to stay at home, you'll be forced to go out when ill, which means that you will infect people around you who will be people like you. So the poor will infect the poor and the inequalities will increase. Or else imagine that you want to go and see your grandparents, your elderly grandparents, and you want to make sure that because they're vulnerable, you don't infect them. So you want your family, yourself, your partner, your 2 children or whatever to take tests. Well, that will cost you about 15 quid, given the current cost of tests. And what that means is that if you are poor, if you're choosing between eating and heating, you're going to be put in a situation where you either go and see your elderly relatives and put them in danger, or you don't go and see them. That's not increasing choice. What Johnson is doing is not giving us freedom. He's giving us the classic freedom of the rich to do what they want, but taking away the means by which the poor can exercise their freedom. So inequalities will increase in a massive way. The third thing is, it's not only you'll have inequalities, you will increase social tensions and social conflicts. If you look at the history of pandemics, sometimes they bring people together, sometimes they produce solidarities. And we've seen remarkable solidarities in this pandemic. For all that has been awful, we've also seen many millions, it was estimated up to 14 million people in mutual aid groups up and down the country before you count in all those who are involved in street level actions, informal looking in on neighbours, a tremendous sense of solidarity. And it's that solidarity that kept us going through the pandemic in a way that the state could never do. There aren't enough state functionaries to look after all of us, to deliver food to all of us, to check up that others are okay. We did that ourselves. When people come together in communities, we saw what we can do, which the state can never do for us. It was a tremendous demonstration of possibilities. So sometimes pandemics do bring us together. But as Bonnie Henry, who was the chief medical officer in British Columbia in Canada, put it, she said, we're all in the same storm. We're not necessarily in the same boats. And unless you give the material support to everybody to make sure that every boat is seaworthy, everybody can afford to stay at home, everybody can afford to test, then actually what you do is you increase division. And once you put the poor in a position where they can't keep themselves safe and others safe, that they have to go to work, you begin to create a politics of blame. People start blaming those who go out. They characterize them as COVIDiots. They see them as enemies who are trying to attack them. And so you create social division and social conflict. And sometimes it's racialized, as indeed there is a prospect in this country, because, of course, ethnic minorities are in more precarious positions. What is more, ethnic minorities have less trust in government and are less likely to get vaccinated. So you begin to see the politics of blame. And if we look historically, we'll go back to the Black Death. And in the Black Death, you found exactly the blame of minorities for disease. And Jewish people were blamed for poisoning the wells. And over 600 Jewish communities were destroyed. And in one day, during the Black Death in Strasbourg, 2,000 Jewish people were burnt to death. We saw what can happen when you begin to divide and you begin to blame. And those are the dynamics that this government is setting in motion by creating a situation in which some groups are not able to keep themselves safe. But I want to finish by broadening out a little, because I completely agree with the point that was made that one of the dangers we're beginning to get is a narrative which says the government got it right, which begins to say that the problem with COVID wasn't COVID, it was the response to COVID. It was what they like to call lockdown, but much more often was protective measures and supportive measures. Those were the problem, we're told. So, for instance, when it comes to mental health, and it's perfectly true, there's a tsunami of problems with mental health. Many people on the right, the Telegraph, the Mail, are beginning to argue, well, that was entirely due to the measures taken around COVID. And it's simply not true. Of course, there were problems of social isolation because we didn't provide the funds so everybody could stay connected. But much of the mental health problems were due to the trauma of getting infected, of a loved one getting infected, of fearing getting infected, of the economic consequences of getting affected. It was COVID that was the problem, not the response to COVID. And one of the things that we've forgotten about, and I think we must make sure it's not forgotten about, is that at the moment, the argument is all about back to normal. It's about getting back to the way things used to be. And we're forgetting that for 2 years, we've talked about building back better and learning from this pandemic, the problems which have led to the pandemic being so serious and dealing with those problems. Now, we've already just heard a really powerful and eloquent argument about one of the critical things is the need for a properly funded NHS, not to let it atrophy through austerity, not to reduce the number of beds, not to reduce the amount of PPE, not to run test and trace through private call centres and people who don't know their patch and aren't trusted, but rather to run it through locally trusted NHS. That's one lesson we need to learn to build back better. And one aspect of that, I think, is to take mental health seriously. As a psychologist, of course, I'm concerned with mental health in particular. And for the 40 years I've been a psychologist, almost every Tuesday, I hear a politician saying, we must take mental health more seriously. And nothing happens, nothing ever happens. And now, with the tsunami of problems we're seeing, we've got to understand the importance of investing in mental health, and not only in clinics, but to make sure that there are people in our schools and our colleges and our universities and our workplaces to support our mental health. That's one thing we've got to take very seriously.
Okay.
The second thing, sorry, I'll only about a minute or so.
Thank you.
Second thing we've got to take really seriously, I think, is the importance of connectedness. We've seen the costs of isolation. We've seen how much damage it does, and yet we are a completely atomized society. A society in which people are completely set apart and against each other. We realize the importance of connectedness. And when that was mooted in the last general election, this was seen as a mad far left proposal that everybody should have Wi-Fi and everybody should have the computers to keep in contact. We see the importance of maintaining connectedness. And the final thing, and I'll finish with this, this has not been one pandemic. It's been multiple pandemics, because it's been a pandemic of inequalities. The experience of people, even in the first lockdown, in a middle-class house with a nice garden, which they could sit out in the sun, was completely different from the experience of those who lived in a high-rise flat with several children not being able to get outside, in terms of experience, in terms of getting infected, in terms of getting hospitalized, in terms of dying, all the statistics we've heard. This pandemic has been like a barium meal which reveals the rotten state of the body politic. And it shows us how we have got to take those inequalities seriously. Inequalities in housing, inequalities in education, as well as inequalities in health, because they affect all of us. And only if we build back better in terms of a society with a decent NHS, with a decent set of communities in which people are not isolated and which we address inequalities, only if we do that will this pandemic have had something good come out of it. And I'll just stop my phone and stop there.
Thank you very much, Steve. It was great to hear you. And I think it's important to keep the anger going, because it is, as you said, there's blood in their hands. Or as the Lancet or the British Medical Journal a year ago said it was social murder, right? You know, and that was a phrase from Engels over a century ago about the conditions of how pollution, industrial pollution, was killing hundreds of thousands in Britain. Anyway, so thanks again, Steve. And so the last speaker is Joan Twelves, who's from the Zero COVID campaign, is going to tell us a bit more about the campaign and how we go forward and lots of other things as well. Thank you, Joan. Go ahead.
Right. Thank you. It's a bit daunting following that in terms of both of the last two speakers. And I have a specific task here, so I will avoid going into the why I'm involved in the Zero COVID because of my own personal anger and my own personal situation of having shielded for 2 years and also living on a multiracial, multi-community estate where issues around racism and inequality are, you know, major issues. However, I have a task here and I'll try and stick to it most of the time. And that's to get more people involved in Zero COVID as a campaigning organisation. And we want to tap into your ideas about how we can get our message out. Some of those ideas were coming out in the breakout room, so hopefully they've been recorded. But after 2 years of a government whose handling of the pandemic has been one of the worst in the world, it feels as though we in Zero COVID have failed. Not because the public don't understand how awful the government has been, nor that it's only wishful thinking to say the pandemic is over, but because we're up against a Tory, corrupt, arrogant, ideological machine which considers profit more important than people, having a party more important than sticking to the rules, and public health as an inconvenience. And we also have a Labour opposition who spent most of the pandemic going, me too, as though they're a 5-year-old and haven't been able to put forward their own arguments. And if anyone here, which I don't think is going to be the case, has any doubt about how awful things have been in this country, then 175,000 deaths, fifth in the league table, I think it is, then that should make it game. And as the leak in yesterday's Guardian said, we are now facing a situation where the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the Cabinet have agreed that they won't test adult social care staff or NHS staff at the frequency recommended by clinicians because there is no funding to pay for it. So the place where we actually would hope would be the safest, going to a hospital for an outpatient's appointment or going to your GP where they have, you know, it was difficult to begin with when there was no PPE, but in recent months they take as many precautions as they can. Now they won't be able to because they won't be able to test, so they won't know if they're actually positive, and you'll have a GP seeing patients because the government has demanded that they are seen face to face, and I haven't seen them retract that demand at all. So, in case you need reminding, as I said, I think most of you here, that Zero COVID policy has been one of an elimination strategy. It's a vaccines plus approach. We support vaccination plus mitigation and protection. And it's spelt out on our new all singing, all dancing website, zerocovid.uk, in both about us and why we campaign. So if people would like to look at that, they will see a whole list of our demands. But I think there's immediate demands we have to have, which are very simple and are based on what has just been taken away from us. We have to keep free mass testing. We have to keep self-isolation for those who test positive. We have to keep the mask wearing mandates. We have to keep contact tracing, and we have to give the funding to the local authorities who are the best at doing that. We have to pay increased sick pay from day one of illness and keep that £500 COVID grant, which is all the more essential if people are having to pay for increased heating at home if they're sick or if they're shielding. We have to demand COVID safe places across hospitality, all workplaces, schools and colleges, including good ventilation and social distancing. And we have to provide the NHS and local authorities and other social care providers with the emergency funding and resources they so desperately need. I think that there may be other things we should be demanding, but I don't think we can have a smaller list than that, because most of those are the things they just decided we don't need anymore and they don't want to provide any funding for. It will cost more, of course, as the economy plummets. So if you want to get more involved or want more information, you can contact us at info@zerocovid.uk or put your email in chat. I'm hoping somebody's putting the links in chat. But finally, just to become more global, and as Steve said, we should stop being parochial, and it's not just about vaccines, it's what's going on in the rest of the world. I do want to say a few words about the horrendous events of the past week, which have been more scary than most weeks in my lifetime, and I've lived through quite a few scary ones, because I don't think we can talk about COVID pandemic in isolation. We can't put the triple threats of war, climate crisis, and more pandemics into separate boxes. Climate crisis means there will be more pandemics, more lethal viruses, as ecosystems are destroyed and more zoonotic diseases jump from one species to another. Climate crisis also means there will be more wars and more refugees. And war, of course, exacerbates climate crisis. I don't think those Russian weapons are particularly eco-friendly or green. And we've been told in the last 2 days that radiation is rising from Chernobyl. Radiation that when that blew came as far as this country. So we do have a personal interest, even though it may seem a small country far away. They blew up an oil depot yesterday. That will pollute a whole area. And now Putin is upping the nuclear threat today in the last couple of hours. Moreover, there have been reports hidden away in the small print that COVID is rife in both armies, but particularly the Russian army. My heart goes out to those civilians who've been trying to protect themselves at home under attack, especially those who've been trying to shield to protect themselves from infection and now having to leave their safe havens. Those pictures of women and children trying to get on trains in the crush of bodies. Their only protection were thin cotton masks. It was interesting to see how many were still wearing those masks in the hope that it would give that small protection. Just imagine if that was us. But there have been some good pictures, because not only were the women and children going on trains, there were also the pictures of those women who had stayed behind and were making Molotov cocktails in the snow yesterday. I thought that was really uplifting and really heartening, and made it so clear that the Ukrainian population is not accepting this invasion. So I think we have to end this conference, not just talking about zero COVID in the pandemic, but also declaring our solidarity with all Ukrainians who are defending their country from a gangster imperialist aggressor. I hope everybody here agrees with that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Joan. So, yeah, and getting involved in zero COVID, we'll have a half an hour or a bit more for questions and answers, contributions now, right until 5 o'clock or so. Just as something about zero COVID, as you know, the URL is zerocovid.uk, but there is a separate zero COVID campaign in Scotland. I think there's a group in the north of Ireland, but there's certainly an all-Ireland campaign called We Can Be Zero, which was launched by a similar group to the Independent Sage called ISAG. So this is just to let people know that we understand that there are different there's been a devolution of health systems in the UK, between inverted commas. So anyway, okay, so I'll open the floor to people. If you want to stick your hand up and put a question to any of the three, and we'll take you. So yeah, I think Rowan's the first one up here. Yeah, go ahead, Rowan.
Thank you. And thank you to all the speakers. Apologies if I'm a little, my microphone's a little bad. It's been a problem. So I'm just going over my notes because it was extensive and there's so much that could be said. I'll ask a question of each of the speakers, if that's okay. To Jacky, I was really interested in sort of the scale of the failure. It's something I've been following all the way through. And I'm also really intrigued by sort of what has and hasn't stuck with the general public in terms of sort of what's damaged the government, what hasn't. I mean, Partygate struck me as definitely appalling, but as a significantly lesser crime than what was done to care homes as just one instance. It involved an obvious example of grotesque hypocrisy, but just in terms of the scale of the damage, it was, I wouldn't want to say trivial, but yeah, I mean, in comparison. And yet it hit them much harder. I mean, not hard enough to actually damage them, it seems, in the immediate sense, and they seem to be responding to it in the worst possible way. So I'd be very interested in a response on that, and sort of why you feel that might be the case. And to Steve, really, really interesting and informative bit, and you know, the Observer, I feel like they've as somebody sort of been involved in the trans struggle and seen how badly they've got that, I have to say I'm not terribly surprised by sort of them being awful on other issues. But I think the point about the mental health crisis being a sort of pre-existing problem is something that you know, I'd love to hear more about, because I see how it's very cynically used by sort of COVID denialists and skeptics of various kinds. And it strikes me that there's just such an obvious level of cynicism here, since none of these people seem to be talking about the mental health crisis before COVID, where it was very sort of demonstrably and empirically showable. So it'd be really good to hear on that. And I guess to Joan on the sort of and to Steve indeed on the scale of thing. I recently read sort of this book. It's called The Imperial Mode of Living, and I think that whole global dynamic is really brought out well here, because I think it's not necessarily just enough to point out that parochialism, but to locate it. The parochialism that we're experiencing seems to be located in the fact that there is a sense in which we're more isolated and insulated, at least in a very short run, even if it's a sort of not a false economy, so to speak, but it's a false assurance. You know, in the long run, all of these problems are going to start affecting us. And just sort of how well do you feel we are prepared for the shocks of this sort of global warming and other crises on the horizon, given how badly, you know, we've responded in terms of being so parochial on these problems? Anyway, thank you if that's not too much, but really, really great.
I'll take a couple more speakers and get questions from the floor, and I'll get the speakers to come back. Andrew.
Hi, yeah, so Andrew Berry, I'm also a Unison activist, and I mentioned this a bit earlier on about, you know, I've been arguing or discussing, shall we say, because it's actually been quite positive, and I'm getting somewhere with Islington Council trying to take a bit of a leading role in trying to make sure that they're following the most up-to-date science, using the most up-to-date technology in the future. And I actually had an email chat with Steve about this as well. So basically, you know, what I'm wondering is also how zero COVID could perhaps tap into that, and maybe look at maybe getting some areas, or some, like local government would be an obvious one, but possibly other areas to try and come up with some sort of charter, some sort of accreditation ideas around what would be the absolute minimum standard, high standard that we would expect, and getting this to be sort of councils or other bodies to sign up to that, so that they can then be saying, this is how we do it, and then take it into the community as well. So, you know, supporting, you know, hospitality and other areas to follow that advice, to make places, because isn't it just about employers? It's about making services safe for people to want to go to them. So whether they want to go to a library, or whether they want to go to the pub, to feel that doing their absolute best they can to make it as safe as possible. So I'm just wondering what, you know, going forward, what sort of role perhaps the campaign could play in that.
Okay, anybody else want to stick up their hand before I call back the three speakers for a couple? Joseph.
Yes, just a short question for all speakers, to come back to Joan's provocative statement that zero COVID has essentially failed. Steve referred to, you know, the Observer and post-pandemic. I mean, this has been taken up by a lot of people. to what extent can we challenge that narrative? Is it going to take another wave before that truth, or that lie rather, is challenged?
Okay, so look, I'll take it in reverse orders, if I may. Joan, Steve, and Jacky, right, for a couple of minutes, and then, or if you can, I'll do all those three questions in a couple of minutes. But I'll be generous.
I wasn't intending to be provocative, saying zero COVID had failed. We just know that we haven't got that message across. It's been introduced from the start of people kind of saying, "Oh, that just means you want a load of lockdowns." And now we have, the pandemic is over. So we just have to keep banging our heads against a very thick brick wall, I think. I'm not saying we stopped doing it. I was quite interested in how well prepared we are for the horrors that we are witnessing at the moment. We clearly aren't. 12 years of austerity revealed right at the start of the pandemic that it'd be one of the things, any preparedness for any pandemic had been kind of thrown out the window, warehouses full of out-of-date equipment and nothing being done about it. That's even before you got to the fact that the government didn't want to do some of the things they were recommended of them. So I have no faith at all in this government being prepared. I would, in any shape or form. I would say, from my own experience in the local authorities also do have the equivalent of COBRA meetings and staff who do emergency planning all the time. And I suspect an awful lot, if they've got any money left, it is something that I suspect local authorities are better equipped to do than the government ever has been. And so both in terms of local authorities, NHS, and all the organisations that also have emergency planning, it's going to be about the money rather than their willingness to want to do these things. And it's going to be really difficult. And I do think we have to kind of make it very clear that this society faces enormous threats, whether it's from flooding as a result of climate change in some areas which have never been flooded before and now getting, 100-year storms, somebody said three in the last year, or whether it's from another pandemic, or whether it's from the threats to the NHS, or war spreading across to here, radiation. Then I think we need to kind of keep raising these issues, because it's very easy to let them slip, and give support where we can to those organisations who do want to prepare, even if the government doesn't want to.
Steve, go ahead.
Okay, so let me start off with the issue of have we failed? And I'd make 2 points about that. The first is, right at the beginning of the pandemic, the narrative from government was that they were limited in what they could do by the frailty of the public. The whole notion of behavioural fatigue, that they couldn't put things in place because we, the public, wouldn't be able to put up with them. And I think the consistent message of the pandemic has been that things are precisely the other way round, that actually levels of adherence, I won't say compliance, because compliance sounds as if you're just doing something you're told to do, levels of adherence to measures to control COVID have been incredibly high at every single point. You look at the polling and you see that people are in tune with the science and ahead of government, first of all, in calling for measures when there are spikes in infection, and secondly, in being cautious about lifting things too early. And in fact, something like 80% of the population were against what was announced last week. So if we failed, I don't think we failed with the public. Quite frankly, although there are loud voices which are, anti everything, which deny the pandemic, actually most people agree we ought to be doing more. What has failed is translating that onto a political level, and I think that's a failure of political organisations. I mean, in many ways, I think we could have expected the Tories to do what the Tories did. If I may be controversial, what has disappointed me is the failure of Labour and others to express a coherent alternative strategy. There's been criticism, but an alternative strategy has never been there. So when it comes to failure, I think the question is, with whom have we failed? And I don't think we failed getting over our message to large numbers of the public. The second thing is, what is it that people object to? And again, I think it's worth going back a bit and remembering the autumn of 2020, when there was the controversy between local authorities, Andy Burnham and others, and Westminster about local COVID measures. And the point was, they weren't against measures, they weren't against doing something, they were against doing things, but without giving support to people to deal with the consequences. So if you want to put local restrictions in place, you also need to put local financial support in place. It's one without the other that's the problem. But over time, because restrictions have been put in place without support, people have gradually become anti-restriction because they don't expect the support. But ultimately, the failure is a failure to put support in place. And it does seem to me that going forward, making sure that we have the support to keep people safe is really critical. And absolutely, Andrew, we're still working on the scores on the doors idea and the idea of making spaces safe. The argument which is making fresh air in the 21st century as important as clean water was in the 19th and 20th century. And those are things that are not only relevant to COVID, but keeping people safe more generally. I mean, so for instance, if you look at schools, people talk about CO2 monitors as if they are simply about COVID and the transmission of COVID. Actually, when CO2 levels go too high, kids become drowsy and don't learn as well. It makes sense to have good ventilation and good CO2 more generally. It makes for a better and healthier society. So we ought to be doing much more to put those supports in place. And the same goes, I'll just finish with this, on the question of mental health. It's perfectly true that if kids were sent home from school and they were in a context where they couldn't continue to do classes and they couldn't keep in contact with each other, it had very negative consequences. We called all the way through that if you were going to do those things, it was only acceptable if it was matched by support, so that every child had Wi-Fi and every child was given a computer, and it didn't happen. So it's not the measures that were the problem, it was the measures in the absence of support that was the problem. And that's when people begin to get angry, and that's when people begin to potentially throw out the baby with the bathwater. But as I say, I'm more optimistic than many about our traction with the public. And I think if we laid more emphasis on protection and support, then there would be even more traction for our arguments.
Thanks, Steve. Jacky?
Thanks. It's difficult to keep track of some of those questions. I think I was asked right at the beginning, how the government got away with it. But anyway, I'm going to answer that question because it's a very interesting question. And somewhere in the book, I put the quote, from Stalin: 1 death's a tragedy and 1 million deaths is a statistic. And as the death rate went up, it just became a statistic. And it was really interesting and kind of very sad. A contributor to our book is Lolly Akinola of Bereaved Families for Justice, who's written 2,000 words about what the death of his father meant for his family. And what's so shocking about all of this is people just throw these statistics around now. First of all, it's difficult. I mean, your colleague said 175, I said 180,000. People don't really know because there's so many different ways of measuring it. But it's just become another huge figure. And we forget that those are all individual tragedies. And, the irony for me is that before, all the trouble in Ukraine started out, Johnson was in hot water over Partygate when he should have been in hot water over 180,000 deaths. And that amounts to a plane load of people going down every day in this country since the pandemic started. Now, you imagine, with that big storm the other day, there were stuff on the news about planes coming in, or if a plane had crashed, there would have been a huge to-do, and quite rightly. That's been happening every day since the pandemic started, and they've got away with it. So I've written down here in big letters, responsibility and accountability, because what we need to start saying now is, who's responsible for this mess, and who's accountable, and how are we going to hold them accountable? And not for nothing was a report of our inquiry, Misconduct in Public Office. They need to be held accountable for what happened. And, at the bottom in big letters, I've written, what's going to happen to this public inquiry, because that's where we can find out what went on, excuse me, and say, who did this? And it's not just about the deaths. I mean, those are at the top of the pile. It's about £37 billion wasted on test and trace. It's about all the contracts that went to their mates. It's about 8 billion wasted on PPE that can't even be used now. There are huge things to be looked at here. Other countries, I'll just say this to finish with, other countries have actually won court cases about compensation for families of those who died, or who was to blame about this. So I don't think that Johnson, who at the moment is, enjoying being a sort of Poundland Churchill posturing around the place, I don't think he should be allowed to get away with any of this because of what's happened in Ukraine. We've constantly got to come back to, we need to know what happened here and somebody needs to answer for it. So that's my thoughts on that matter.
Okay, just before somebody else wants to put their hand up, I just want to say something as well, right, in terms of, how did the government get away with it? And I think they got away with it in Parliament because, as Steve was mentioning, the official opposition, Labour, decided not to politicise the issue. They thought it's a public health issue and we can't politicise that. And the response to a pandemic, the response to a health crisis, what sort of response you have, what sort of strategy is eminently political. It depends on what you put first. You put people first, or do you put profits? Do you put restarting the economy first? And Labour chose the front bench of the Labour Party that we have now with Starmer, decided that all they would do was simply criticise the government and saying that we could do better. And they, despite all the support that there was from independent Sage and even Sage itself, actually, to a certain extent, right, they just had to follow the science if they really wanted to. But there we are. So, I agree with what Steve was saying, in terms of the public, there was a lot of support, even now, despite the lack of mitigation measures. Okay, a lot of people are no longer wearing masks in public transport, but still, when I've taken the tube in London when I had to, at least half of the people are still wearing masks, and in shops as well, right? So, but we've got a job to do. We've got a job to do, and, we still got to be there to put the message out, because this pandemic is not over. Johnson is pretending it's over, but it's not over, and the possibility of new variants occurring in a few months to come are there, because the rest of the world is not vaccinated, because we haven't been able to eliminate this one. Anyway, so I'll leave it at that, and hear if anybody else wants to stick up their hand. No, all right, okay. Well, no, did I see a hand go up? Yeah, Terry Harper.
Thank you very much. Yes, I was really interested in this same storm, different boats idea, because as people know, I was stuck in South Africa for a year during COVID, and what a different boat that was. My particular concern has been the media coming back to Britain after a year and finding that the BBC was doing vox pops and simplistic stuff, where in South Africa they were the top scientists speaking with PowerPoints on the main state broadcaster, and teaching us so much more than my friends knew here. And people may know that we've got a media strategy group, which I find absolutely fantastic, where we write letters to all the right-wing newspapers, to all the newspapers, almost daily. Our group, Isabel may want to speak about this, and it's one thing that we can continue doing, and we get quite a lot published. And we had a Taiwanese speaker who said, somebody asked her, when are you going to open up? And she said, well, if it's a tiger at the door, no, we won't. And if it's a kitty cat, yes, we will. And she said that China was the kitty cat, and we, the UK, was the tiger. And that really surprised me, because obviously most of their air traffic is with China, and they're not bothered about people coming in and out of China. But they're really bothered about people coming from the UK. So we are, we're well known. I listened to South African radio, and people talk yesterday about Britain's war. People are going to start, around the world, ostracizing us. And I wondered what my question is, where we go from here, in terms of should we unite as groups? Should we, our group, unite with, say, Indie Sage and all the big boys, or and Zero COVID Coalition and the bereaved families and long COVID? Or should we concentrate on our particular neighborhoods and do something like mutual aid and kind of spread the word that way? So that's my question. I'd be interested in the responses.
Okay, look, it's 5 o'clock now. Is there any couple of other, questions, and then we can wrap it up with Steve, Jacky, and Joan? Any other quick questions or comments? No, it's been a long day. It's been sunny outside. Okay, right. Look, very quickly, 1 minute from each of you. Right? Do you want to, Joan? I'll take it in the other order. I took it for Joan, Jacky, Steve. Yeah. How about that? Yeah. Joan, do you want to say a couple of words?
I think my word is the pandemic is not over, and that whilst people may, I'm really happy that people are going out in the sunshine and feel relaxed, and everybody needs that. But on the other hand, we all have to stay wary, and certainly my experience of the people I have contact with is that most of them are people they may not wear their mask on the tube all the time. They may not wear it into a shop, but they're going to be careful. They will still keep their social distance from people. They don't object when other people ask them to take precautions, because I do that all the time with people. And so I think, it's not over, is it? And everything's getting worse. So I'm feeling quite pessimistic at the moment. So, but, the turnout for this conference has been good, and people do want to continue to campaign. So that's good. And we will keep on doing some events and things. And if anyone wants to get involved in this, do please contact us, because we really need some more bodies. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Jacky.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to say the same thing as Joan. Actually, it's not over, and I was really shocked by the story about the Observer saying the post-pandemic match. That's the message that's come out from Johnson, and unfortunately, we have got a libertarian prime minister who just couldn't care less. And in the same way that it's going to be down to the Russians to get rid of Putin, I'm afraid it's down to us to get rid of Johnson. The pandemic is not over, and it's really. I live in London. It's really difficult to get people to. The hospital's still in difficulties. There are ambulances queuing outside, and everybody's behaving as though it's gone away. So hats off to you guys who are fighting this, and let's hope we don't get another much more serious variant. And it's shocking that we've had such bad politicians in place at a time when we've had this crisis. Thank you.
And everybody here, don't forget to buy Jacky and John Lister's book on the health service, which is coming out in a few weeks' time. So that'll make you angry. It'll make you want to carry on the fight. Okay, Steve.
So, in terms of strategy, certainly, it's not my position to tell you what your strategy should be. But I do think, first of all, I think it's now quite apparent that we are not going to shift this government's point of view. They're quite clear about it. And as somebody put in the chat, there was the leak of the Cross-Westminster briefing saying public health now is no longer the priority. It has to be balanced against cost. The point to be said about cost, of course, is that depends upon priorities, and it depends upon what you're prepared to raise in tax. I often remind myself that we've been told that this is the biggest crisis of our generation. It's almost as extreme for us as the Second World War, and we need to rebuild. Well, remember, at the end of the Second World War, income tax rates were 99.25%, the top rate income tax. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go to 99.25%, but unless we redistribute a little bit of wealth, we're not going to be able to solve this. And if you do it within Tory tax policies, of course you can't afford public health. So we can't influence government, but I think we can do much more to work with trade unions, to work with local authorities, and also to work with the public, to be public service broadcasting in a sense, to help people understand how to keep themselves safe, because people want to keep themselves safe and the government isn't making it possible for them, and therefore we're going to have to make it possible for them. So I think there is a really big role. And sadly, I suspect there's going to be a need for us in the future if and when a new variant comes along. So it's not over. And we're not all over, but we do need to think perhaps about different strategies and different alliances to move forward.
Great, thank you very much. For all the speakers who've come today, for all of you who stuck it out on a sunny afternoon here, and do get involved with the Zero COVID campaign. We still got a job to do because the pandemic is not over, and we've got our own specific things about campaigning with trade unions, community organisations, the left and the Labour movement, and Independent State's done a fantastic job in terms of giving us this information. The long COVID campaign is looking after the people who are suffering from that and speaking up for them. But we must work together, and I think we can. That's one of the things that we should be discussing. So anyway, thank you very much again to everybody for staying. Sign up for the campaign if you're not already signed up, and follow us on our website. And we do have fortnightly or bi-monthly or twice a month campaign meetings with speakers on the current state of affairs or particular topics. So do follow us. Thank you very much again for coming, and we've carried on the job. Thank you very much. Good night.